The proclamation of the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus heard of the death of John the Baptist, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. The crowds heard of this and followed him on foot from their towns. When he disembarked and saw the vast crowd, his heart was moved with pity for them, and he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples approached him and said, "This is a deserted place, and it is already late. Dismiss the crowd so that they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "There is no need for them to go away. Give them some food yourselves." But they said to him, "5 loaves and 2 fish are all we have here." Then he said, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he said the blessing, broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples, who in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up the fragments left over, 12 wicker baskets full. Those who ate were about 5,000 men, not counting women and children. The Gospel of the Lord.
Our Gospel for this Sunday is taken from St. Matthew. We have been reflecting on a community fed by God and how a community is generated precisely by the food that God gives. They jokingly say, "Where 2 or 3 Filipinos are, there is eating." Our sense of community seems to center on food, and I guess it is part of the culture of so many people. Yet what type of food do we take? And what type of food generates our community? In the first reading from Isaiah, God the Creator promises food and drink to people. Yet, aside from physical food and drink from the earth, God offers another type of food: His Word, His love, His covenant. His Word, His love, His covenant that generate a community that lives by the divine food that God offers to us. This does not mean that we will not look after the needs of people for physical food. No, that remains, and that is essential. But having given people bread, rice, vegetables, drink and wine, people still need the Word of God, the love of God, communion with God. And this is affirmed by St. Paul in the second reading. In his letter to the Romans, he tells us that in this world of separation, where many causes are invoked for people to separate from one another, there is one thing that will always endure: the love of Christ for us. The love of Christ will always be with us. Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Our community life, if you want to call it that, our community life with Jesus will remain. He will feed us with His love, and the life of this community depends on the love of Christ. That is our food, the love of Christ. Now, in the Gospel, in narrative form, we have these beautiful teachings woven also. The setting is Jesus and His disciples moving to an isolated place after mission and after the sad news of the death of John the Baptist. Hard labor, a harrowing bit of information about a violent death, I mean, who would not want to go to a faraway place just to rest, just to meditate? A legitimate need that Jesus wants to respond to, not only for himself, but for his disciples. But when they got to this faraway place, they realized it was not that far after all, for the crowd followed them, bringing their sick people. They were looking for Jesus and his disciples. They were hungry. Hungry for love. Hungry for compassion. Hungry for healing. And look at the love of Jesus. He could have easily said, look, I deserve some respite. I deserve some rest. If you are suffering, I am also suffering. And my disciples have been on mission. Please give them also time to rest. But no. As St. Paul declares, nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. So he attended to the needs of the people, forgetting his own needs. He feeds them with love. He feeds them with the assurance that God always has a spot in his heart for the poor and the suffering. God will always be here to feed them. Then the disciples told Jesus, it's getting late and this is a faraway place. Better send them home so that they could travel with the sun still up. And besides, so that they could buy their own food. As we will learn later on, there are thousands of them, at least 5,000. And the suggestion of the disciples was logical. But Jesus, gave an astounding answer. You give them something to eat yourselves. There is no need to disperse them. No need to disperse them. No need to scatter them. They are already gathered around me. Let them stay. Let them recline. And we will have a feast. Imagine that sight. Imagine thousands of people gathered, centered on Jesus. He doesn't want them to be scattered, but to remain gathered, a community around him. He had already begun to feed them with his love. Now he tells the disciples, feed them too. But they had only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here, look at the marvel of the love of Jesus. He takes these simple gifts, 5 loaves and 2 fish. He says a blessing, meaning he thanks God. He prays. He prays to God, the God of love, the God who created heaven and earth, the God who promised love, compassion, and covenant in the first reading through Isaiah. The God who will not leave his people. Jesus prays to God, offering 5 simple loaves and 2 fish. And with God's blessing, we do not know how it happened. The bread, the fish were distributed. And lo and behold, everyone was able to eat. Distributed by an act of sharing. Blessed by God, shared among brothers and sisters in a community that has feasted on the love of Christ with Jesus at the center. Imagine that. What a banquet. Everyone has had his or her fill, and there were leftovers, enough for another meal. This is the power of a community fed by God, fed by God's love. They are able to share, and no one is left wanting or needy. If we feed on God's love, if we become a community centered on Jesus, there will be sharing, there will be no hunger, there is enough for everyone, and there will still be enough for the next generation. How I wish this type of community will happen in our midst, and that the worldwide community may be a community of sharing rather than hoarding, a community of compassion and love rather than of neglect of other people. But this will happen only if we gather and not disperse, gather around Jesus, who is the love of God, and feed on His Word and feed on His love. His love being our food will be the love that we share with others. My dear brothers and sisters, I notice that when we eat together, not in a buffet style, but if we are gathered around one table, sharing the same bowl of rice, sharing the same one plate of vegetables, you know what happens? You get only what is enough for you, mindful of the other people seated around the table. And chances are, at the end of the meal, there is something left. Because we have become sensitive to each other's needs, there is always something extra. When love is the fundamental food, and the community feeds on love, no one goes hungry. There is something left for the next meal. That is also the spirit of Saint Jean-Marie Vianney, patron of priests, who multiplied in the community the food that is the Word of God, the body and blood of Christ, the mercy of God through catechesis and the sacrament of reconciliation. He lost his voice. You could barely hear him, but people saw, touched the love of God. And the community, ours, that was described by his superior when Jean-Marie Vianney was being assigned there as a community that did not have much love for God. This community grew. And he, Saint Jean-Marie Vianney, was able to fulfill his mission from the Vicar General. Put the love of God in that community. It has become a community when it has learned to feast on the love of God. The Word has been exposed. Let us now fulfill it.